Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Njoku and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about some draft favorites that as we go into the 2022 fantasy football season, I just can't get enough of. These are players that regardless of whether it is their ADP or their overall upside going into this upcoming season, I always manage to find these players on my rosters at the end of drafts. So as I typically do, I'll go ahead and present statistics in order to justify the reasons as to why you should be targeting these players in your upcoming fantasy football drafts. So let's go ahead and let's get into it. Let's talk about T. Higgins. Every time I have an opportunity to talk about T. Higgins, I light up like a Christmas tree because I just want a piece of the Cincinnati Bengals offense, and I think T. Higgins has such great upside in the 2022 season. Now, if you want a piece of the Cincinnati Bengals offense, of course, you can go ahead and do so via Ja'Marr Chase or Joe Mixon, but they're in the first round. And unless you're going to use a first-round selection on those two players, you're often going to be relegated to having to select either T. Higgins, Joe Burrow, a little bit farther down. But when I want to invest in an offense, I don't want to have to take that quarterback. Or you have to wait till the double-digit rounds to go after a Tyler Boyd who, quite frankly, doesn't have that many top 36 wide receiver weeks under his belt over the last couple years. Nonetheless, let's talk about T. Higgins and his potential and the deep dive stats that I went ahead and, accumulated for today's episode. So when we go back to 2020, T. Higgins' rookie year with Joe Burrow, he was incredible. Weeks 3 through 10, prior to Joe Burrow going down with the injury, he was playing 78% of the offensive snaps and averaging 14.3 fantasy points per game and was the number 11 overall wide receiver throughout that 7-game span. So we all quickly learned just how good T. Higgins can be, and that immediately transitioned into the 2021 season. And though there was conversations as to whether or not Ja'Marr Chase was going to be the real deal, even with Ja'Marr Chase stepping up and having, the second best rookie wide receiver performance of all time in terms of fantasy points scored, even with those numbers, T. Higgins was still a valuable prospect on a weekly basis and put up incredible fantasy numbers for us. Again, in the last 21 games, T. Higgins has played with Joe Burrow under center. He's averaged 7.86 targets per game and 13.44 fantasy points per game. With Joe Burrow against the NFC North, against his own division rivals, the Ravens, the Browns, and the Steelers, he's averaged, this is a crazy number, 17.4 fantasy points per game in the 7 contests he has played against them with Burrow. Those kind of numbers are crazy. And if you just go ahead and isolate his 2021 numbers and we go ahead and track his overall pace, assuming he had not missed those 3 games due to injury, we would have seen T. Higgins last season be the number 9 overall wide receiver in fantasy football with over 220 fantasy points. He was on pace for a season with 90 catches, 1,300 receiving yards, 8 receiving touchdowns. Again, those are typically numbers you don't see for the number 2 wide receiver of an offense, especially considering how much success Ja'Marr Chase was having on the opposite side of the field. Nonetheless, when you look at the last 10 games that T. Higgins has performed for the Cincinnati Bengals, even including the playoffs, in the last 10 games, he has 7 performances of over 95 receiving yards. His overall, contribution, utilization in this offense has proven, he's a mainstay and he's going to continue to be a key part of their overall success. And going into 2022, the question is whether or not Joe Burrow can sustain and help support 2 top 12 wide receivers. We know Ja'Marr Chase is going to be able to accomplish that. The only question is whether or not T. Higgins can. And when I've looked at quarterbacks over the last 5-6 years who have supported 2 top 12 wide receivers, what they all had in common was over 4,200 passing yards and 30 passing touchdowns. Even last year, Joe Burrow had 4,600 passing yards and 34 passing touchdowns. Those numbers are only going up for Burrow as they've improved his line, which is going to allow him to support 2 top 12 receiving options. And we honestly all saw a glimpse of this late last season from weeks 8 through 17 of the 2021 year. Throughout that span of time, T. Higgins was the number 7 overall wide receiver, averaging 14.67 fantasy points per game, while Ja'Marr Chase was the number 8 overall wide receiver, averaging 14.64 fantasy points per game. Again, these guys as a duo were dominating the league. One week, one was going for 50. The other week, the other one was going for 35. The amount of fantasy points that they were able to put up, the amount of success this Bengals offense is going to find because of that offensive line improvements that they have made, giving Joe Burrow more time in the pocket is only going to allow these, wide receivers to find themselves open in many different circumstances. Again, Joe Burrow was the most sacked quarterback amongst all in the National Football League last year. You go ahead and protect him with 4 new starters in the offensive line. I think Ja'Marr Chase, T. Higgins, Tyler Boyd, they're all going to find success. And again, when you have Ja'Marr Chase on the other side of the field, and he's pulling double coverage, imagine what T. Higgins is going to be facing against the number 2 corner of every defense. That sounds like a recipe for success. All right, now before we go ahead and move on to the next player I wanted to mention, again, a reminder, if you guys have not yet already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. We're making fantasy football content on the daily for the entirety of the 2022 season for the singular goal of trying to help you win a 2022 fantasy football championship. So do yourself a favor, click the subscribe button below. Outside of that, again, for those of you who are looking to go ahead, prepare yourselves for your upcoming draft, you can do so via Underdog Fantasy. Again, for those of you who go ahead and travel there and make a first-time deposit using promo code Andrew, not only will you get my 2022 fantasy football draft rankings for a half and full PPR scoring format, which includes rankings by tier at position at quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, kicker, defense, along with my top 200 flex. So if you're interested in going ahead, drafting in these competitive best ball leagues in order to get yourself some experience for this upcoming weekend's drafts, go ahead, be sure to sign up today. There's a link down in the description of the video. Use promo code Andrew today. When you go ahead and sign up, all it takes is a minimum first-time deposit of $10. If you want, you can deposit more. You deposit $50, it's going to be a $50 match. Again, that first-time deposit match is up to $100 when you use promo code Andrew. So take advantage of this opportunity. And for those of you who do so, understand that the email is going to be coming from me with the draft ranking. So you got to check your spam and your junk folder because it may get, lost in there. Many people have reached out, said, Andrew, I don't see the rankings. And then little do they know it's sitting in their junk folder the entire time. Also, I will be sending updated draft rankings Saturday morning. So be sure to sign up today so you can get those ready to go before your upcoming drafts. All should be ready to go. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into the second player I wanted to mention, Aaron Jones. Now, even though Aaron Jones is considered by many top 10, top 12 overall running back, this is a player that in my second rounds, I cannot stop drafting. I don't understand why he falls to this point. I think he should be probably coming off the board early second round, but sometimes I get him in the late second. And I'm thinking to myself, there's no way I'm passing up on the opportunity of taking a running back that could honestly be a top 5 player by the end of the year. Now, we've all witnessed the success of Aaron Jones. In the last 3 seasons, he has been the number 2, number 5, and number 12 overall running back in fantasy football. All while Aaron Rodgers had a 2-year campaign of being a back-to-back MVPs of the league. 85 passing touchdowns for Aaron Rodgers. Crazy numbers that he put up over there while Aaron Jones was still getting the job done in the last 2 years. Again, Aaron Jones, the last 45 games he has played, he scored 40 touchdowns. These kind of numbers are very seldom duplicated by other running backs, all while he was able to put up minimum numbers of 1,100 total yards, 10 plus touchdowns, and 47 plus receptions in each of the last 3 seasons. These are numbers that, again, only special running backs are able to contribute. And that's why we have to treat Aaron Jones as one of those players. Again, in the last 3 years, he's averaged 16.19 fantasy points per game. And when he has been given opportunity to be a lead back in this offense, my goodness, he has taken advantage of that. Anytime in the last 3 years, he's been given 15 or more opportunities in a game. Opportunities are a combination of rushing attempts and targets in a game. So 15 or more opportunities. 31 out of the 45 games he has played, so that's 70% of the time. He's been able to do that. He's averaged 19 fantasy points per game in those given games. That's just crazy numbers. You give this man opportunity, he's going to take advantage of it. Anytime he's played against the NFC North, his division rivals, the Bears, the Vikings, and the Detroit Lions, he's averaged 18.5 fantasy points per game in the last 15 games against them. Over the course of his career, anytime he has played 50% of the snaps or more, he's averaged 17 fantasy points per game. Now, he's done that 37 times. In the 8 contests in which he was below 50% of the offensive snaps, he only averaged 12.13 fantasy points. Of those 8 games, 5 of them came in 2021 when he was dealing with his lingering injury. Now, this goes ahead and brings up the conversation. What injury, Andrew? Aaron Jones got injured? I don't remember that. Well, if you guys go back to week 10 against the Seattle Seahawks, Aaron Jones went down with a knee injury. And that was the beginning of where A.J. Dillon began to step up and take over this offense late last season until finally Aaron Jones was, feeling a little bit better in the playoffs and had an incredible game, but we'll get there in just a moment. But nonetheless, that really opened the door to A.J. Dillon stepping up. Now, in seasons past, 2019, 2020, we saw Jamal Williams be a, pretty active part of this offense. We knew that they always wanted to use 2 backs. Jamal Williams in those 2 seasons, 146 touches and 150 touches. Now, you go ahead and you elevate A.J. Dillon last season. He comes out with 221 total touches on 224 total opportunities. A pretty good contribution for a running back who really wasn't given much opportunity early in the year, but when he was asked to step up, certainly did so. That being said, a lot of people are worried about the uptick of opportunity that A.J. Dillon is going to see. The idea that A.J. Dillon had, more rushing touchdowns inside the 5-yard line than Aaron Jones did last year. And if Aaron Jones is not able to get to his 10 touchdown plus range like we've seen in seasons past, maybe he's not going to be at the level that we want him to be. But it's okay. Do not worry, because the Green Bay Packers offense has enough opportunities out of the backfield in order to supply both these running backs with enough ample opportunity to make them successful. I mean, since 2019, this team has been number 9 in terms of total running back opportunity and number 10 in terms of total running back rushing attempts. As long as you're in the top 10 of those categories, you can certainly have 2 top 24 running backs. And we've talked about this in the past in prior videos when I've talked about why, A.J. Dillon is a breakout running back. Go ahead and check out that video on the channel. When you have an offense that is going to be at the top 10 of both those categories, you're easily going to be able to support 2 top 24 running backs, to say the very least. Now, the whole conversation transitions to, if we're not too worried about A.J. Dillon, then what could we expect to see out of Aaron Jones this year? Well, without Devontae Adams and Marquez Valdes-Scantling in the lineup, we have a recipe for success. Anytime Devontae Adams has been out of the lineup due to an injury or has left early over the course of the last 3 years, Aaron Jones has averaged 60% of the offensive snaps and 25.68 fantasy points per game. In those contests, he was averaging 80 rushing yards per game, a rushing touchdown per game, 5 catches, 57 receiving yards, and 0.6 receiving touchdowns per game. As a whole, the entire Green Bay Packers backfield had a huge uptick in points, not even just counting Aaron Jones by himself, but even the other running backs, whether it was Jamal Williams or A.J. Dillon in seasons past. As a whole, that backfield was averaging 37.49 fantasy points per game. So everyone was succeeding out of the backfield as they committed to running the ball and found a lot of success. In those 8 games, Aaron Rodgers targeted running backs 86 times. So that's the hope that we're kind of leaning towards when we're thinking about Aaron Jones and his potential this year. And again, when we're talking about receptions and the ability for Aaron Jones to be a vital part of this offense, in the last 3 years, he has been the number 2 receiving option of this offense in terms of total targets. Amount of receptions he's gotten has been incredible. Again, 49, 47, and 52. Again, when you're able to get that much utilization out of the backfield, those numbers are probably only going to trickle upward this season. I mean, the last time we saw Aaron Jones play was in that playoff divisional matchup against the San Francisco 49ers. If y'all remember, Aaron Jones had 10 targets, 9 catches, 129 receiving yards. It didn't matter what he did on the ground and still was able to get himself 12 rushing attempts. But his utilization in screens as a dump-off check down in order to protect Aaron Rodgers, I think it's a perfect recipe for success. And though I have him a little bit lower ranked than other running backs, I still find myself continuing to draft Aaron Jones because of his potential. All right, moving on. Let's talk about Dalton Schultz. Let's talk about the tight end position going into the 2022 fantasy football season. I've mentioned Dalton Schultz multiple times this offseason as a guy that, again, when you're associated with a Cowboys offense that last year, had the 5th most passing attempts amongst all teams in the league, continue to target their tight ends. Again, what their offensive coordinator, Kellen Moore, has done over the last 3 years, targeting their tight end the 10th most times amongst all teams in the National Football League. When there is opportunity to be had, a fantasy prospect is going to flourish with that. Now, in the last 2 years, we have seen Dalton Schultz be the number 14 and number 4 overall fantasy tight end. In the last 20 games that he has played with Dak Prescott, he has averaged 10.45 fantasy points per game. Those are great numbers. Now, if you go ahead and look at it as a 16-game season, you'll only get 160 potential fantasy points out of that, but I only see his numbers going up. Because of the departure of Amari Cooper, Cedric Wilson, and Blake Jarwin, we now have 182 total vacated targets. If those targets are going to be spread out amongst the receiving options, whether it is CeeDee Lamb, Zeke Pollard, and whoever ends up being that second wide receiver, of course, Dalton Schultz is going to get himself an uptick of total opportunity. And where his opportunities are most deadly in terms of fantasy points is in the red zone. Again, last season, he was number 9 amongst all tight ends in the league in terms of red zone targets, 14 targets that led to 6 receptions. He was number 8 in terms of targets inside the 10-yard line, 7 targets that led to 5 receiving touchdowns. Now, when you go ahead and compare the Dallas Cowboys amongst all teams in terms of tight end red zone opportunities, they were number 9 in terms of total targets, 21 as a team for 9 receiving touchdowns. So even though he didn't, get all of the receiving touchdowns in terms of tight ends this last season, I think those numbers could certainly go in his direction. And let's not forget, Amari Cooper led this team in red zone targets last season. He had 17 of them, 6 inside the 10-yard line. So if those numbers begin to, disperse in different directions. So why not Dalton Schultz having another uptick of fantasy points this season? Again, when he has played with Dak Prescott and he has been given 6 or more targets, he's averaged 12.4 fantasy points per game. He's done that in 14 out of his 20 games with Dak Prescott. When they've played against the NFC East, he's averaged 14.22 fantasy points per game. So that's against rivals like the Eagles, Washington Commanders, and New York Giants. Overall, Dalton Schultz is in a pretty good position to succeed. And this is a player that they're not taking off the field. Like I mentioned, Kellen Moore targets their tight ends, but they always want to keep a tight end on the field. In fact, last year, they played 96.73% of their total offensive snaps with at least one tight end on the field. On top of it, Dalton Schultz last season was ranked 3rd amongst all tight ends in the league in total routes ran. He had 548. Again, he's going to be on the field. He's going to be a primary receiving option, and also, he's a damn good blocker. Again, last season, according to Pro Football Focus, he was the number 11th ranked run blocking tight end with a minimum of 150 overall snaps last season. As a whole, this is an offense that certainly needs someone to step up and become a primary receiving threat. Now, as the season begins, you're not going to have Gallup, you're not going to have Cooper, no more Cedric Wilson. So that leaves CeeDee Lamb probably as the primary, but we have to look at what Dak Prescott has done with number 1 receiving options in seasons past. His number 1 receiving option, going back to the last 5 years, has had 96, 132, 86, 119, and 120 total targets. Dak Prescott really likes to spread the ball around. There's a reason why Zeke has had 7 plus receptions each of the last 4 seasons. Dak Prescott likes to spread the love. So if in fact we get a situation where CeeDee Lamb isn't getting 170 targets, maybe that helps the potential of Dalton Schultz. All right, moving on. Let's talk about the next player I wanted to mention, Josh Jacobs. Listen, I think Josh Jacobs is slept on by far too many, and that's why I want to once again bring him up. In the last 3 consecutive years, Josh Jacobs has put up at least a minimum of 1,200 total yards and 7 total touchdowns. Now, like I've mentioned in the past, outside of an injury being sustained by Josh Jacobs, he's always been a top 12 running back in fantasy football, even going back to his rookie year in 2019. Now, in his rookie year, he played from weeks 1 through 15 healthy and was the number 11 overall running back throughout that span of time, averaging 13.97 half PPR fantasy points per game. Now, obviously, he sustained an injury and ended his season. You go to 2020, no injuries in sight. Well, guess what? He was the number 8 overall running back, averaging 14.32 fantasy points per game. And then you go to last season. The beginning of the year was a little bit of a stumble because he had a turf toe injury. Obviously, against the Ravens, he hobbled. He had to change shoes at halftime in that week 1 contest. Many of us remember thinking, man, is this guy really going to have an injury immediately? And yes, he hasn't been able to stay healthy his entire career. But when he is on the field, and he's on the field for a majority of seasons, he's been a huge contributing factor because last season, from weeks 4 through 18, when he was healthy, he was the number 7 overall fantasy back, averaging 13.04 fantasy points per game. Overall, Josh Jacobs has been a fantastic fantasy option. When you look at what the Raiders have done in the last 3 years, they've been the number 7 team in terms of total running back opportunity and number 9 in terms of total running back rushing attempts. So why not go ahead and invest in Josh Jacobs, a player that is relatively slept on, a guy that's averaged 13.85 half PPR fantasy points per game in the last 43 contests that he has played for this team. Now, I understand. You think, Andrew, he's not going to get as much opportunity. This is going to be a running back by committee. Listen, I understand that Amir Abdullah and Brandon Bolden and a rookie by the name of Zamir White sits behind him. But those are not names that are typically, intimidating. If you had told me that Kenyon Drake was still in this offense, I'd be a little bit worried about that. If you told me that, they signed Sony Michel, I'd be a little bit worried about that. But at this moment in time, I don't see those other players in this backfield as a major concern. I mean, just look at what Josh Jacobs has been able to do in his career. When he's been given 15 or more opportunities in a game, that's 35 of the last 43 games he's played, he's averaged over 15 fantasy points per game. When you give him 20 or more opportunities, he's averaging over 18 fantasy points per game. With opportunity, he has been a valuable option in fantasy football. And I mean, he's been one of the better backs in the league, one of the most elusive backs. And even though you look at him and think Alabama running back, maybe he's just, dipping his shoulder and making plays that way, he's had the 4th most missed tackles forced per attempt last season. And on top of it, since coming into the league in 2019, he's only behind Nick Chubb in terms of missed tackles forced. Nick Chubb 181, while Josh Jacobs 177. Both of them have played well. But a lot of people sleep on Josh Jacobs' overall potential. And I understand you're worried about the receiving work. And, the career high numbers he set last season, 64 total targets, 54 receptions, 348 receiving yards. Those are most likely going to diminish this season. But even with Amir Abdullah and Brandon Bolden taking those touches, and maybe Zamir White taking an occasional rushing attempt, it's not like we haven't seen a very similar scenario in seasons past. I mean, let's look at, the New England Patriots last year. And why I want to make that correlation is because the offensive coordinator for the New England Patriots last year was Josh McDaniels. He's now the head coach of the Las Vegas Raiders. And they're probably going to have a very similar contribution from their running backs. Last season, we had Damian Harris only play 42% of the snaps and still average 13.41 fantasy points per game. A guy that was able to get over 900 rushing yards, 15 rushing touchdowns, got himself 18 receptions and 132 receiving yards. If you wanted to give Damian Harris more receiving work, he would have been able to accomplish it, but it's a matter of whether or not they want to go ahead and commit it in that direction. But over the last 5 years, when you look at what Josh McDaniels has been able to do with the New England Patriots, that team has led all teams in the National Football League in running back opportunities since 2017, and number 4 in terms of running back rushing attempts. The only time in the last 5 years that the New England Patriots weren't in the top 12 of both of those categories was in 2020, when Cam Newton was the quarterback and he himself had 137 rushing attempts, which certainly tipped the scales in his direction. But let's go ahead and let's look at some of these other running backs that we have seen produce for the New England Patriots over the course of the last 5-6 seasons. Last year, obviously, Damian Harris was the number 13 overall running back in fantasy. The year prior to that, Cam Newton took over. When you have 12 touchdowns in Cam Newton's overall, stat line, it's going to diminish running back value. So we eliminate that one. We go to 2019. James White was the number 22 back, while Sony Michel was the number 28. They had a little bit of a split there. A little concerning, but once I go ahead and read these following stats, it probably makes you a little bit more confident. James White in 2018 was the number 8 overall running back in fantasy. Dion Lewis the year prior to that was the number 13 overall running back. And LeGarrette Blount the year prior to that, number 8. So in 4 out of the last 5 eligible seasons for the New England Patriots backfield, we have seen a singular running back be a top 13 back minimum. That, in my opinion, is going to be the Josh Jacobs role in this offense. The play calling from Josh McDaniels with how many weapons they have outside, whether it's Darren Waller, Hunter Renfrow, or Devontae Adams, they're going to be able to run the ball very effectively because defenses cannot stack the box against the Las Vegas Raiders offense. In my opinion, this is going to be a perfect recipe for success. And a lot of you may be sleeping on the idea of drafting Josh Jacobs, but where he's currently coming off the board in that dead zone area, I find, a lot of safety in the selection. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next fantasy option I wanted to mention. Another player that outside of having injuries has always been at the top 12 of his respective position. And that's kind of why I wanted to mention Adam Thielen. This is another one of these players that, if he stays healthy, I know he's 32 years old, but if he does, we're talking about top 10 fantasy value. Again, when you go back to 2017, he was the number 10 overall wide receiver. In 2018, he was the number 7 overall wide receiver. In 2019, he got injured, but prior to his injury, weeks 1 through 7 was the number 8 overall wide receiver throughout the first 7 games of that year. Okay, obviously the injury ended the season, no problem. Then you look at 2020. He goes back to being a top 8 wide receiver, boom, automatic success. And in 2021, though many of us were expecting immediate success, he dealt with an injury. But prior to said injury, from weeks 1 through 12, he was the number 7 overall wide receiver, averaging 14.57 fantasy points per game. And he was on pace for setting career numbers across the board, mainly in touchdowns. Now, before we talk about the touchdowns, I also want to mention the fact that even when Adam Thielen went down, KJ Osborne stepped up and he was averaging 11.42 fantasy points per game between weeks 13 through 18. And he was the number 16 wide receiver throughout that span of time. Ultimately, whoever the number 2 wide receiver of this offense is going to find success. So whether it has been with Stephon Diggs or Justin Jefferson, Adam Thielen has always found success. Again, in the last 2 seasons with Justin Jefferson, in the last 26 games, Thielen's averaging 14.51 fantasy points per game. He has scored 24 receiving touchdowns in the last 26 healthy games that he has played. And now you go ahead and you elevate this offense by bringing in Kevin O'Connell, the former offensive coordinator of the Rams. This is another one of those pieces, similar to T. Higgins, where I want a part of this offense. And unless I have a first-round pick to use on Dalvin Cook or Justin Jefferson, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take Thielen. Just like in the idea that I'm going to take T. Higgins because I can't get any of those other pieces for Cincinnati. So if, in fact, you're able to get a piece of Adam Thielen at the low ADP that he's going at, and you're able to get a full healthy season out of him with an offense that is going to be elevated because of the offensive-minded head coach. Kirk Cousins has been playing incredible, 4,200 passing yards, 33 passing touchdowns each of the last 2 seasons. I mean, really, Adam Thielen is just going to play that OBJ/Robert Woods role. The number 2 receiving option on the outside. They'll go ahead and put JJ in the slot, and they'll just dominate defenses. We know how much the Sean McVay-esque schemes always want to have 3 wide receivers on the field. And as long as Adam Thielen is out there, Kirk Cousins has that much comfort in him to send the ball in his direction, regardless of the current circumstance. There's so much potential in this pick. And though, you may be worried about the age of 32, I believe the discount that he's currently at is worth the selection. All right, moving on. Let's talk about our final player, David Njoku. Listen, David Njoku is one of these players that I purely, if I'm not getting a top 6 tight end, if I'm not getting Kelsey, Andrews, Pitts, Kittle, Schultz, Waller, I want David Njoku. Now, Njoku is a former first-round selection. Again, this is a very talented receiving option. And though, in the last couple years, he hasn't found a lot of success, he has been a top 10 fantasy tight end before in the past. And he could very easily accomplish that this year because of the current circumstance, whether it is quarterback play or the opportunities that are now being granted for him. Now, again, besides the fact that Kevin Stefanski came into this offense in 2020 and brought in a new scheme of terms of running the ball and throwing the ball to the tight ends at a very effective level, that has obviously elevated this team as a whole. Now, in the last 2 years, the tight end position has ranked 8th amongst all teams in terms of total targets, 281 of them. Last year as a whole, if you go ahead and take all 3 tight ends that participated for this team, Bryant, Njoku, and Hooper, and collect their stats, they combined for 142 targets, 95 receptions, 1,053 receiving yards, 10 receiving touchdowns, and 215 half PPR fantasy points. That's the level of contribution that tight ends get within this offense. Now, you go ahead and you remove Austin Hooper from the lineup. He's gone. And if you go ahead and just look at what Austin Hooper has done in seasons past, he has led this tight end position since 2020 in terms of total targets. 131 of those targets going in his direction, while David Njoku had 82 and Harrison Bryant had 66. So with the ability to be on the field and at least just play more snaps, the target numbers are only going to rise. And with opportunity that leads to success for David Njoku, anytime last season he was given 5 or more targets, the 4 games that took place, he was averaging 12.23 fantasy points per game. I mention it all the time. Opportunity leads to success in fantasy football, and he's going to have a lot of that based on the quarterback play that he'll see this year. Jacoby Brissett, first and foremost. When we go ahead and look at Jacoby Brissett's statistics as a starting quarterback who has played full games since 2017 with the Indianapolis Colts, if you look at his per game averages in terms of utilization of the tight end position, he has targeted tight ends 9.33 times per game, and that has led to 10.78 half PPR fantasy points per game for those respective tight ends. As a whole, we saw a lot of success going back to the days where it was Jack Doyle by himself, Jack Doyle and Eric Ebron, and even last year when he filled in with Tua with Mike Gesicki. Those are the best games Mike Gesicki had all year because Jacoby Brissett wants to target, his respective tight ends. I mean, we even saw it in the preseason. Go to week 3 of the preseason, watch those highlights. In that game, David Njoku was the primary tight end starter, and he had an 80% route participation. When you're running more routes, of course, you're going to have more balls thrown in your direction. He had 4 targets, 3 catches, and 38 receiving yards in just a quarter of play. That's the kind of level that we're going to see out of David Njoku this year. And even when we go from Jacoby Brissett to Deshaun Watson, guess what? Look at 2019 stats from tight ends with the Houston Texans. 106 targets, 71 catches, 767 yards, 9 receiving touchdowns, 166 fantasy points. Let's look at 2020. 100 targets, 75 catches, 900 yards, 7 touchdowns, 171 fantasy points. Deshaun Watson is going to throw the ball to his tight ends. He did so in the past with Akins and Fells with the Houston Texans. David Njoku is just a better version of both those guys, to say the very least. Young, athletic tight end that is going later on in drafts that I obviously continue to get a piece of. That's going to go ahead and conclude our draft favorites for today's episode. Again, there's a lot of other guys that we're going to talk about in the coming days prior to your draft that hopefully you can target, but I just wanted to go ahead and give you guys a little bit of an understanding as to why I trust these players going into our 2022 fantasy football draft and why I continue to target them. Thank you everybody for watching. Be sure to subscribe, click the like button down below. Let me know down in the comment section other players you cannot stop drafting this offseason. And of course, be sure to check out Underdog Fantasy. Use promo code Andrew today. Not only will you get a first-time deposit match up to $100, but when you make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, you'll get my 2022 fantasy football draft rankings within 24 hours from my email to yours, along with a Saturday update so that when you're drafting this upcoming weekend, you're ready to go and set yourself up for a successful 2022 year. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and until tomorrow, I'll see you guys. Peace.